This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, a vibrant online learning community providing high-quality educational content, the opportunity to connect with peers, and an outlet for new ideas in the field of nonprofit fundraising research.
So the interesting thing is a lot of people in our field of prospect research and prospect analytics actually have the fundamental building block for cognitive computing.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with David Lawson, co-founder and CEO of New Sci LLC and author of Big Good, Philanthropy in the Age of Big Data and Cognitive Computing. Hello, David. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm really thrilled that you've taken the time to talk to me today. I read your book while I was traveling, and it felt like you were right there talking to me and making me laugh and chuckle as you explained your big vision of the future.
Well, one thing, data and algorithms can be kind of a dry topic, so I'm glad that the humor came through. I've found over the years that if you want people to understand something complicated, you have to kind of lighten it up a little bit. But, more than anything, I wanted to keep making it relevant to our field. And I hope that came through too.
Oh, I think so. So I've known you here in Florida for a number of years. I've heard you present. I've read things that you've written, but I haven't seen you write a book. This is your first. Why a book and why now?
Well, I had tried my hand at authoring as a co-author, actually on a couple of books, but I have wanted to write a book. And 20 years ago, I actually put the content together, but I just couldn't pull it together. And what I realized was what I was missing was an editor. And one of the wonderful things that happened in my life in between was I married Lawson, who is a terrific editor and actually has edited other books. And so that I owe this really to her. I can take credit for the content, but I can't take credit for having gotten it out there. The book's been there, and that's one reason if you read the book, it has elements of what would have been the first book, which was talking about how the field had evolved and screening and what we thought of as big data back in the 90s, early 2000s, and how it was merging with software. But of course, with cognitive computing and big data, then it exploded. So it's really, in some ways, a book and a half.
Yeah, it is very well organized. It makes it very easy to read and follow the concepts as you build on them across the book. So kudos to Lori. I happen to be one of those people. I read the book, from title page to the end of the book, and I really like the preface as well. And you painted a picture of cognitive computing in parallel to your experience living through the resistance to wealth screenings, which you alluded to. And now, of course, wealth screenings are best practice.
Resistance to change, that's just part of human nature. There's a wonderful, if you Google it, the 50 reasons not to do things. And it's this wonderful graphic. And if you really look at those 50 reasons, you could apply it to anything, which means that a lot of the resistance has very little to do with the substance of what the change is and more about just our innate resistance to it. So screening, of course, I was intimately involved with and brought a lot of that change. But I've also seen it with things like email, where people, email is not personal enough. It has to be a handwritten letter. Social media is a joke. The World Wide Web is just filled with junk. There's nothing of substance. So I saw with big data and cognitive computing, it was going to go through the same grind. And so I wanted to show people that here are things that now we take as standards and best practices that went through the same thing. So don't make the mistake of thinking because you're hearing some of those same negative things being said, that this isn't going to one day be best practices, because it certainly will be.
Yeah, you also mentioned that it's still a growing field. The products are still growing. And one of the questions or negative things that I've read about big data, cognitive computing, has to do with bias. So if there's bias, implicit or explicit, in the data set that it's learning from, that's going to translate into the results. What do you have to say about that in fundraising? Like, how can we eliminate that?
Well, I mean, first off, there is no eliminating it, but I think the first thing we start with, and it's one of the chapters in the book, we as humans have confirmation bias, and we need to accept that. That's how we get up in the morning. We have biases, our favorite foods, the weather we like, the colors that we wear, the styles we wear. We have these biases to survive, because if we actually approached every day that everything was possible, we could literally be that, like the little kid in Toys R Us. Of course, you can't be in Toys R Us anymore, right? But that little kid who can't do anything because everything is there. So that confirmation bias is very strong. And so one of the classic areas they're talking about right now is around HR. So what if the algorithm has a bias against an ethnicity or a gender? Well, let's step back. HR has had a lot of biases over the years. And one of the reasons we're trying to get diversity is because you haven't had diversity. So I find it a little ironic when then they bring in an algorithm and say that somehow it's the algorithm's fault. Now, having said that machine learning starts with no bias of its own. So the bias is what you give it. So for instance, in the HR example, or let's look in our world in a prospect pool. If your prospect pool, I remember being at a Ivy League school, this is 20 years ago, and the IPOs were happening and the .com before it was the .bomb. So a lot of younger people were making money, like the Yahoo founders and such. But this Ivy League school said to me, David, that's all well and good, but our major donor's average age is 72 years old. And what I said to him at that point was, I said, well, as long as that's who you're going to focus on, then that will continue to be true. What I can tell you that what is changing is there are people who are younger who now have the money that it used to take till you were 72 to have it. And if you go and ask them for money, you might be pleasantly surprised. So that was a human confirmation bias, but where would an algorithm adopt it? Well, if an algorithm studied that Ivy League school and said a look-alike model, well, what are your major gift prospects? And they're 72-year-olds, so let's say they're male, predominantly. Well, then that's what it's going to look for. And then the Yahoo founder, or boy, if you were a young minority woman, you'd have no chance of ever being in that sort of look-alike model. So that's why the data scientists today need to look for that, because there are ways you can adjust that in an algorithm that's actually much easier than adjusting a human, like convincing that person, which I didn't that day. Even though I showed them tons of evidence, I showed them what Stanford was doing, they still looked at me like I was crazy, that people in their 20s, even if they had hundreds of millions of dollars, were going to be major gift prospects. But I could say to an algorithm, ignore age, and it would just ignore it.
Right. So in fact, we might actually be able to diversify because it doesn't have bias on its own.
It makes for a good movie that AI has an agenda. The reality of AI is it has no agenda. It has no malice, but it also has no sympathy or empathy either. It doesn't have those human characteristics. Those things it learns. It learns whether is that what I want it to do? Is that what I want it to know? Now, that does mean that you could teach it to be a very sympathetic algorithm or one that's not. There's no question that I believe that could be done. But, we kind of project ourselves onto it. And to me, still the most dangerous and most powerful cognitive computer, the power of it is it has the power to imagine and to do good things, but it also can have an agenda. Think about a meeting. I think this is one of the things we're going to have to get used to is AI being in a meeting with us, right? So that's where like Alexa's already in our living room, but we're going to need to have Alexa in meetings or some version of that. The AI isn't there going, boy, I should have gotten that job. Or, I know that person just said that because they're really trying to take a dig at me for this. And, there's just a lot of kind of stuff that's frankly a little high school at times, even in big business, that it doesn't have. Now, I also think that means it's going to at times say some uncomfortable truths. And as Al Gore said, inconvenient truths. It's going to say, well, you may think that about the 72-year-olds, but when we look without age, we actually have a large population of people who are not fitting that criteria. So how are we going to deal with those? I'm not saying that AI won't make people uncomfortable, but what I am saying is it's not after as much people worry about their job, it's not after your job like sometimes the colleague is.
That's so true. And, you give such great examples, and just now, but also in the book. It was wonderful to have the list of different things that cognitive computing can apply to now in fundraising. And one of the things you said really stopped me in my tracks. You said that cognitive computing would allow us to scale personalized fundraising. And one of the negatives that gets talked about analytics in general is that it's not personal. Can you explain how it might scale personalized fundraising?
Yeah. So when you look back at how fundraising was done, decades ago, it was very personal. There were actually very few people at the top. And we would build very rich profiles, and you could luxuriate with time. So on those few people, it was very, very intimate. A lot of data gathered, and again, time. Now, below that, it was really just mass fundraising. So you were sending out mail, maybe you were telemarketing. And so it was either incredibly personal or very impersonal. I mean, it was a big deal when it would say, Dear David versus Dear Mr. Lawson for a lot of people. So as we started then, though, to have an explosion of wealth and people realized, hey, we have a lot more people, thanks to wealth screening, on our file. We want to try to build information on as many of those as possible. But as that grew, we actually narrowed the scope of what we would actually obtain. So rather than building a really rich profile, we got all the way down to just a score. Now, the problem was that then showed, hey, wait a minute, we actually do need to understand more about the person's passions and interests. It's not just about their money, and it's not even about just their connection to us. We need to understand which of our projects and programs match up with their passions and interests. So what's happened when you look at the modern gift pyramid, it's really an hourglass. So you have still this bottom for the people who kind of give, annually, and they respond in the mail, although that's going down. And then at the top, we've done an amazing job at the top. I mean, I remember the first $1 billion campaign, everybody was just speechless. And now, of course, it's just routine. And so we're doing great as far as getting that top 1%, even 0.5% to do just amazing things. But that hourglass has just gotten tighter and tighter in the middle. So what I was alluding to is I see AI's ability to ingest a great deal of data and to make sense of that data, that we could start to get a more personal look at a larger group and start to primarily match up projects and programs to the right people. There are a lot of people, for instance, who don't give to their alma mater because they think, well, that's higher ed. I want to give for homelessness, or I want to give for, let's say, the environment, not realizing that there are programs, maybe a school of social health and policy, that graduates people who work at homeless shelters, or they're working on research that would help clean up rivers, things like that. So kind of what I call is kind of like the Netflix effect, where you have all of these different things, but what am I going to show you? And that's what I meant there, was that I think we can scale personalization in the middle, which will get people from that bottom up into the middle and then more naturally flow to the top.
Wow. Well, I hope it does better than Netflix does.
Right. I will. You remember that Amazon has a richer palette, and you're right. I think Amazon is the better one for what we do, especially the larger organizations and, of course, the larger university. It's really amazing how many programs and projects. You see more and more campaigns now will roll up to, let's say, 6, 7, 8 themes, and then under that are the actual programs. And that just shows you how broad the reach is of a lot of these institutions and organizations.
Yes, they have a lot to offer. And the early example you gave about the 72-year-old donors being the norm, but are they really? One of the things I've been reading a lot about in The Economist magazine are autonomous cars and the resistance to that technology. And most recently, they had an article and they laid it out. If an autonomous car caused, let's say 10% fewer deaths or even 50% fewer deaths than human-driven cars, because we know that humans cause a lot of deaths in cars, the number of lives saved would be enormous. And yet the public can't tolerate a single death from an autonomous car. And in your book, you talked about embracing the power of being wrong. Could you expand a little on that as it relates to fundraising?
Yeah, machine learning is an iterative process. It's not machine learnt, right? It literally does learn. And this is something that in the not too distant future we'll just accept. But this is not what we're used to. We're used to technology. It does whatever it does. We might be frustrated at what it doesn't do, but we have to wait for the next version. In this world, it literally is learning every single day. When Watson won Jeopardy, when they first tried, he got like 2 or 3% of the questions right. And at the end, it was high 80%. So at first, you could have said, well, this thing will never win, but you have to allow it to learn. I think autonomous cars, because of the implications of not learning, are so stark that someone could die. It's just a very visceral look at how AI works. And what I will say with AI and autonomous cars, remember, it will never get drunk. It will never get sleepy. It will never get distracted. Look at its phone. So it'll never be thinking about an argument it just had or the meeting it's about to go to. Just taking that out of the equation is already going to dramatically reduce deaths. So the other thing about AI is that you think about what we accept today. I mean, there are people who are getting their license today who are 16 years old. I mean, the most dangerous drivers on the road, yet there they are. Now, they hopefully that fate will allow them to iterate and learn and then one day become good drivers. One nice thing about AI is as it learns, it then can pass on that knowledge to all cars. So imagine if we didn't have to have 16-year-olds on the road, right? That every 16-year-old started as a 30-year-old. That would be awesome. And so, but back to your point, there's some interesting studies about how we compare ourselves to technology. We actually compare the perfect us and actually a perfect plus. So in our mind, what we imagine our score. So let's say the best we ever could do is, let's say, 80% on something. But in our minds, we'll think, but if I really studied, I could do 90%. So we put 90% up against AI. So we're trying man against machine to win this. And I think we have to step back and really look at this technology and say, I know for myself, here in Florida, we have a lot of north-south and east-west roads. I mean, it's almost autonomous driving because people are just so bored driving. There's nothing to see. There's no landscape. There's certainly no mountains other than Space Mountain. So it's just boring. And the idea of getting into a autonomous car, I can't wait for it myself. But more importantly, I want to know that the guy next to me is not drunk, asleep, distracted, looking at their phone, eating a burger. But that value of being wrong, what the other point I was making was that goes back to the Edison, allowing yourself that trial and error. And that's a big part of AI in an organization. I believe you need to think of it more like AT&T thought of Bell Labs, where there's this place where we are going to try a lot of things, but we're not going to connect it to anything. So back to the autonomous cars, it would be more like, a lot of the autonomous car we're on just safe tracks. It's only more recently that they've actually been allowed on the road. So I think organizations will have this laboratory where it's okay for it to iterate. And then when they say, you know what, that's good enough, we'll operationalize it, that's when it will come into the organization. And I think that will make people more comfortable, that they don't just feel like as it's learning, it's making, mission critical decisions.
So maybe it's like hiring an intern. You're hiring the AI as an intern, and we're going to introduce it to our organization.
It is. I put in there the idea of a cognitive colleague, and I think that's a good way to look at it, that initially treat it like an intern. Now, unlike an intern who often comes in and maybe they learn a few things, and they're certainly better at the end of it, but they go off in their world. In this case, it's actually learning and learning and learning. And so at first, you give it light tasks, don't connect it, but as it gets better and better, then you start to allow it to do more and more. But ultimately, this is going to be about augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence. Much like the way that we use things like Waze when we're driving. I remember the first time that I trusted it when it said turn here, and I'm like, well, it's the wrong way, but it knew that there was an accident up ahead. So by going around a cornfield and all this, I actually saved a couple of hours. But to trust that, it augmented my driving. I was still doing the driving, but I was saying, yeah, but you know something I don't know. I can't know what's happened beyond my line of sight. And so that's where I think as we look at these cognitive colleagues, they're augmenting our abilities. That's why I go back to like scaling personalized fundraising. There's plenty of work to do. I mean, I look at our field especially. I don't go around a lot of organizations who say we have too many people. We're always hungry for people. That's why we need volunteers. Maybe one way to look at these are cognitive volunteers, maybe a way for nonprofits to get past the fear.
So before I let you go, I'm hoping you can give a parting tip to fundraising researchers. If someone said to me, how can I be ready for when we need to do a wealth screening? I would have said, get your data cleaned up. But what would you say to organizations now to get ready for cognitive computing later in the future?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to become comfortable with this idea. I mean, we're already, make no mistake about it, games, Alexa, things like Waze, Siri, it's being socialized, so we get used to it. And I think that you need to start to find ways to introduce, algorithms, and models, we've had those for decades. In fact, wealth screening began with a lookalike model. Now, it wasn't, real data science the way we see it today. It wasn't machine learning. But in 1984, we had with Martin Lundy and their electronic screening, there was a score, so that 99, we had to say, I'm going to look at those 99s first. So we were beginning to say, okay, I'm willing to take this advice from this computer software to make some important decisions about who I'm going to go see. If I'm a researcher, I'd want to learn things like Python, R. I would want to be familiar with these. It doesn't mean you have to be a data scientist, but there are a lot of free courses out there. Just have a working understanding. If you're in a leadership position, then you might read a level above that to, a lot in the for-profit world. We see more and more adoption of this. Look at some of the positives they're getting, some of the challenges, like you mentioned the bias earlier. Don't fight the future. This is going to come, and one of the reasons it's going to come is back to our mission. Part of what I tried to get across in the book was it's not just about fundraising. A lot of this technology is going to help us to solve medical issues, environmental issues, social issues, because now we have this cognitive ability to look at a massive data, like every study ever done on diabetes can be now digested and looked at and organized. We can do so many things to make those leap forward. We're not going to have to hope that an Einstein, makes it onto this planet, makes it through childhood, decides not to go into making things, decides to stay a theoretician. Or we have someone like a Steve Jobs who decides that he wants to make things instead of probably living on a commune. And the randomness of that, the fact that we can really point this technology, a cognitive technology, at problems and say, think about this, help us, is just tremendously exciting. I think more than anything, if I was a researcher, I would say just really understand this. Don't feel a victim of it. You have the skills. The interesting thing is a lot of people in our field of prospect research and prospect analytics actually have the fundamental building block for cognitive computing.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing and for writing the book. And thank you, Lori, for editing. And I really appreciate your time today.
Oh, this has been great. Thanks so much.
That was David Lawson, co-founder and CEO of NewSci LLC and author of Big Good, Philanthropy in the Age of Big Data and Cognitive Computing. As David mentioned, prospect research professionals have many of the skills needed to transition into the age of cognitive computing. Do you? Maybe you should consider becoming a member of the Research Connectors at the Prospect Research Institute. Join me in our monthly meetings where we cover topics that are most important to advancing your career. Find out more at www.prospectresearchinstitute.org/research-connectors.